Alright, welcome to the next episode. We're going to pick up where we left off in the prior, where we were installing the oil seal in the back of the gimbal bearing. You have to install this first before you can install the gimbal bearing, otherwise you do not have access to it. So what I used was a seal installer. Looks like this to kind of get it started, and they're pretty cheap. There's a few other ways to get it installed as well, but this was the method that I used to kind of go in there and just basically, you know, tap it along all the edges to make sure it was seated right. And you've probably seen this little device on some of my prior episodes. This is what we use to install the gimbal bearing. You can also flip it around and with a flat surface and actually use it to install the seal. So it actually has a few different purposes. They both work good. It's just once you start using this, be really careful because that installer, the alignment tool, is super heavy and you can inadvertently damage that oil seal if you're not careful. So if you are using this to pound it in, which presumably you would be because you also need to be aligning the motor after this, use this flat edge and take your time as you're hammering it in. You want to make sure you're checking the seal in there to make sure it goes in level. And I've used gasket sealing compound around it before. I've used engine like axle grease as well. The manual, just in case you're curious, says use gasket sealing compound. So definitely go and use the gasket sealing compound, even though if you're used to working on motors like trucks and whatnot that have seals like this, you use axle grease. But yeah, not in this case. Although it does work, use the gasket sealing compound because it'll help with corrosion and keep water out. Okay, and this is what the tool looks like. It's the same tool that you use to align the gimbal bearing up with the motor, the engine coupler. So essentially what you'll do to get your oil seal installed, you slide this in, and this thing is kind of heavy, so you got to be careful. And then you give it a few whacks in the back to completely seat it. As I mentioned, you could damage that seal. If you're worried about it, consider getting 2 seals. So if you damage it, you can pop it out, put a new one in. If it's done right, it'll be flush with this outer edge. You won't feel any kind of lips or anything if it's in properly. So I've got a few videos that kind of show even more detail if you're curious about it, but that's how it is installed. Alright, so next up, what we're going to do is we are going to install the gimbal bearing. There's a few politics on how to install the gimbal bearing in which direction. I've installed it the same direction since the beginning. Had a few people argue with me about which way it's supposed to go. Just so you know, we are going to install it with the notches out, and the dot will be facing the back of the motor. You'll also see in the right hand corner, kind of towards the very back, there's where the grease zerk is. You need to make sure you line that up, and you're going to need a marker to do that. So let me show you real quick how that works. Okay, so if you look, you can kind of see my line that I drew with a permanent marker right about there where the shadow was. You need that because when you're installing your gimbal bearing, you need to know where the spot is for where you push the grease into the gimbal bearing. So it's kind of important. Without that mark, you'd have to guess. I don't know how you'd get it right, but definitely can't do that. Let's talk about parts. So part number for your gimbal bearing, mine is BRP 385-3807, made in the US. Plenty of different varieties. I'm sure Volvo Penta makes one. However, during this year model, the partnership was in place, so they had all kinds of interchangeable parts. Okay. Let's see if we can get this thing open. It's pretty tough doing this with one hand. The things I do for my viewers here. So it actually has the same markings as the other one did. think it says like link belt or something along the edges there, so that's pretty normal. Yep. And there's a part number, and I think it says, there it is, where it says link belt, right there. So anyway, you've got the one here with the dot, which we will not be, let's see, yeah, there's a dot, and then there's the notches. The notches are referred to as these two little guys. So what you want to do first is locate where the oil fitting is, which is right there, and put a mark on this side where the notches are, so you can see where it is as you're installing it. Now I used to just draw one little line to designate where that grease fitting was, or where the grease goes into, but I like to line it up where it shows you the exact width of the hole, so it shows you how much play you have. If you put it in and it needs to like go down a little bit, as long as it's within tolerance, meaning it's somewhere within there and grease can go in there physically, then you're going to be fine. It'll save you from having to pull this thing out multiple times and whatnot. So it does come dry, so don't try packing it like you would regular bearings. You're not going to be packing this. You will be filling it up afterwards. You can actually fill it up before you put the stern drive back on, so that's definitely doable too. So we'll show how to do that. So anyway, for right now, let's go ahead and coat this outer edge with some grease, and we'll go ahead and get it installed. Okay, so you can see here we've got it greased up with our marine grease. We've got, if you put a little grease around this inner race here, it'll keep it from sliding around, just so you're aware. So you're just going to slide this down, put some grease in there, and it'll keep it from rolling around on you. So anyway, let's go ahead and line up with the notches just like this. If you don't see a black mark, you're putting it in wrong, because remember we marked it on the prior episode. So it's also kind of your fail-safe. So let's go ahead and install it. Make sure it's lined up pretty good and start giving it a few whacks. What I like to do is I like to start the gimbal bearing off with a lighter hammer. For some reason I found that when you put the heavier hammer in to try to hit this, which you will need a pretty heavy-duty hammer, it tends to go in sideways, crooked. And you'll know it's going in crooked because you'll hit it with the bigger hammer and it, simply put, will not move. So if that happens and you got to pull it out, use the removable tool, yank it out, and go ahead and put it back in. Try a second time, but I found if you start off, like I said, with a lighter hammer, you'll have better results. Okay, and you will know you've got the gimbal bearing all the way in because, simply put, it makes a different noise. It will only go in so far, and as you're hitting it, you will notice, oh, it's not moving in any further, and it just basically feels like you're hitting a brick wall. At that point, you can go ahead and stop. Another thing you can do too is go ahead and put your fingers behind the outer or the inner race and the oil seal that you just installed, and you'll notice that there is a very little gap, maybe, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch. It's going to be very small. And once you feel that, and you also notice the audible noise as it's all the way seated, you're pretty much good to go. So what we can do now to make sure we got the grease fitting lined up properly is we can go ahead on the other side, and I'll show you that here in a second, and start putting a little bit of grease in there. Okay, so we look on this side. You may or may not have ever noticed this, but this is where you grease your gimbal bearing. It uses a standard style grease zerk, and you'll basically be applying your marine grade grease in there. So what I want you to do first, before you do that, is reach in there, spin the gimbal bearing, feel how loose it is, and then as you start putting grease in there, you should start to see it or feel it tighten up a little bit. That'll tell you that there's grease getting in there. If it doesn't start to tighten up, or it starts leaking around the races, you don't have it lined up. You're gonna have to pull it out and try it again. So it will also leak too if you put too much. You want typically about 2.5 pumps to fill this thing up. Well, let's take that back. It's 2.5 pumps initially, but after you are greasing this thing on a regular basis, you typically are going to do just one. The methodology that I like to use with Zerks is you want to pump super slow, and the moment you feel any resistance on your handle, stop. Otherwise you're going to blow the seals out. So, and the other thing too is with this, if it starts to ooze around the edges, it'll just get this whole entire area full of grease, and that's not good. So you want to do just enough so it doesn't collect dust and dirt and all that grime inside there. You want to keep it kind of clean, but also while maintaining the necessary lubricant inside of the bearings. So let's go ahead and start greasing this side here with our grease pump. Okay, you'll see here I got a little bit of that marine grease left over. It's about 3 pumps. I did start to see it kind of start to come out the bottom, so that's a good sign. What I'll do now is I'm going to go ahead and take a rag and clean all that excess marine grease in there out so it doesn't attract any kind of dirt. Right, that is it. Look how clean that is. Jeez, that is nice. Digging it. So grease it up real well. No issues there. Cleaned it up afterwards. Make it look presentable. The inner part of the race, which is that center piece, put a little bit of grease in there, just so when you install the dry shaft, if you would, it has a nice grease surface in there. But other than that, keep it kind of clean in there. Notice we have no oil. Got all that out as well, so this is looking good. That's pretty much going to do it on this one. The bellows are fine. Exhaust obviously intact. If you have a issue with your exhaust ripped up, it'll just make a louder exhaust tone, so it's kind of one of the side effects. And then obviously up here, if the bellows cracked, water can get in there and basically rust out your gimbal bearing, get inside your motor, and it causes all kinds of issues. So that is going to conclude our replacement gimbal bearing and oil seal behind it. This is kind of a little bit different take on it. I do have other videos on more formal ways to remove the gimbal bearing and the oil seal with a variety of different tools. Let me know if you'd like to see a different route. I was able to get my oil seal out with without having to use a puller because I have the motor removed. I have a special video that shows how to remove it with a puller, so if you need that, throw some comments below and I will link that to you. As always, hit that subscribe button if you're not subscribed to my channel. Like the video if you thought it was helpful. Stay tuned to the next episode. Have a good one.